Hello again everyone and welcome back to the Underground. This is the Intel update for October 5th through the 11th of 2025. The insanity continues again this week, so let's get right to it. Starting off here in the home front, the general state of unrest in many locations continues as before with regards to counter-ICE operations, most of which is focused in Portland and Chicago as usual, but we'll get more into that in a bit. Also in the United States, mostly in the western regions of the country, the digital surveillance of Christian churches continues at the behest of one particular foreign nation. And also this week there have been several developments with regards to disarmament campaigns. Most notably yesterday, California signed into law AB 1127, which is a de facto ban on all Glocks. So in typical fashion, there will probably be more outrage after the bill has passed rather than the lead up to it being passed and signed into law. But this bill bans any semi-automatic pistol which can accept a Glock switch or something similar to that effect, right? It's not just Glocks, but it's any other pistol that can take some sort of similar device. We all know how this goes, so I'm not going to harp on it too much, but rest assured I would be willing to bet that many other states are going to probably follow in the footsteps of California by figuring out a way of banning firearms, not because the firearms themselves are illegal, but because they could be made into something that may be illegal. Of course, the majority of Glock switches are not actually used by proper lawful owners. They're used by gang members, and nobody ever really seems to be interested in policing that kind of activity, but we all know why that is. But that's the situation in the homeland for this week, and around the world, things have been a-happening this week. We, of course, have the peace agreement in the Middle East between Israel and Hamas, which has gone into effect and seems to be holding as much as to be expected. Either way, the general, rough, approximate guidelines of the peace deal that have been agreed to by both sides have been undertaken. There has been a very sharp decline in hostilities between the two main belligerents here in this conflict, so that is a positive development. But once again, we will see if this sort of thing holds for any length of time. As one can probably guess by the way that I'm describing this, I do not have any faith at all that this ceasefire will hold for any length of time. The old rule of thumb is that there's no such thing as a peace agreement in the Middle East. It's just how long is the ceasefire going to last before the war kicks up again. I don't know how long it's going to last this time, but my guess is that this will not end, especially because Gaza still remains, right? That was a major strategic goal for Israel, is to completely take over the entirety of Gaza and basically just make it not exist anymore as a region and just kind of absorb it into Israeli control and push the Palestinians somewhere else, right? That was a major strategic goal for them as a nation. And internal Israeli politics indicate that a lot of politicians in Israel are not happy that Netanyahu agreed to this peace deal. So he is facing a lot of internal criticism because he is letting Gaza remain, at least for now. We shall see, but enough on that for now. Moving over to the Far East, that particular conflict has reignited in the form of both China and the United States engaging in a little bit of economic warfare on their own. Things have been rather tepid over the past couple of weeks with regards to China and the United States negotiating their trade deals. Things were looking up there for quite a while, and then China decided to, as of November 1st, implement a whole lot of export controls on things that the United States needs quite dearly, such as rare earth minerals like lithium and a few other things as well. So that, of course, angered Washington quite a bit, as you could probably expect, so the White House came out with a 100% tariff on China to take effect on the same day. And the meeting between the United States and China, there was supposed to be an in-face meeting between President Trump and Xi Jinping to take place soon. That meeting may or may not happen. It's really uncertain as to whether or not it's going to go forward. So things are not really looking super great for the United States and China. But once again, this is economics in 2025, where the rules are made up and the points don't matter. So in 2 weeks, we may find out that things are doing swimmingly well and then all of this kind of goes away. Who knows? The books are being cooked to an absurd degree, so I don't know if anybody can ever really say what a country's national economic situation is at any given time. But suffice it to say that the economy kind of tanked a little bit upon the news that the White House was going to retaliate with these tariffs once again. There were quite a few mysterious shorts on Bitcoin immediately before the White House announcement on the tariffs, so there are already a lot of indicators of deception and insider trading and a general state of shenanigans being undertaken with this sort of thing. So I don't know, we'll see how it works out, but that's the situation as it stands right now. Moving down south to talk about the strategic movement and the general state of the situation with regards to Venezuela. Rest assured, war with Venezuela is still on the menu, and the U.S. Navy has quietly sent a couple of more destroyers down there to augment the naval forces that are still conducting lots of exercises, training, and a general preparation for war right off the coast of Venezuela. I don't think there was a strike on a narco boat this week, so we've gone a full 7 days without blowing up a cartel vessel, but the general situation still remains as before. The United States has not reduced any presence down off the coast of Venezuela. As a matter of fact, we've increased it quite a bit. So depending on what the United States is trying to do, depending on the strategic goals and what the U.S. is looking to gain from any kind of action in Venezuela, we shall see. It may just be trying to strong-arm Maduro into something that the United States wants, which is obviously, that's obviously the low-hanging fruit of what's going on, but there are ways to strong-arm Maduro that don't involve actually conducting combat operations in his country. The question is whether or not the White House will decide if sending troops into Venezuela is going to be necessary for the strategic goals that we seek in Venezuela, whatever those are. Probably oil, but who knows. Either way, there's a lot of movement going on and certainly a lot to keep an eye on as we move forward. Moving back to the homeland, there have been a few kinetic events that have taken place this week. We'll talk about Portland and Chicago in just a moment, or rather at the end, because there have been quite a few questions as to what the overall strategic goal in these places are, and I think I can maybe clarify some things. But when it comes to actual kinetic events this week, there have been two major events. The first of which was the D.C. church bomber outside St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington, D.C. That was a very interesting case because even though IED attacks and just generally crazy people with explosives tends to be kind of an American tradition at this point, this case was host to quite a bit of information manipulation, and I think that more eyes should be on this case considering the current threats against churches around the United States. I also wanted to mention the industrial explosion that took place in Tennessee yesterday. I didn't have time to slip it into the wire, but this was a very, very kinetic explosion that took place in Tennessee at a major facility that produces explosives for the military. So there have been many, many casualties from this incident, and we'll get more into that in just a second. But the church bomber up first. One Louis Jerry was arrested in Washington, D.C. after he caused a bit of a scene outside St. Matthew's Cathedral in Washington, D.C. last Sunday. It took a couple of days for the details of this case to come to light because it was initially downplayed quite heavily by the authorities and by local journalists who don't really care to highlight any kind of threats against Christian churches. Initially, this was reported as just some crazy guy setting up a camping tent right on the front of the church steps here, as you can see. This is why there wasn't that much focus on this kind of thing, because it just looked like a crazy homeless guy who was trying to cause a scene. This happens in D.C. like every 15 minutes, okay? So this is not really out of the realm of normalcy for the area. Even with the, deployment of troops to D.C., there's still a lot of dystopian elements to the city, and this is one of those things that tends to kind of happen, right? So the church noticed, or rather local authorities, I'm not sure if the church noticed first or if local authorities who were kind of policing the area in advance saw this guy first. Either way, he had set up his little encampment here on the front steps of the church around 6 in the morning before the Red Mass for the year. So again, a special mass dedicated to the Supreme Court justices at this particular church. The Red Mass is held more widely, of course, and is supposed to be a special day to pray for all of those who are involved in the criminal justice field and the court system and things like that. But this particular church hosts their Red Mass for the Supreme Court justices, and over the years, a couple of justices have shown up to attend this Mass, which takes place the Sunday before the court calendar begins for the year. So D.C. Metro Police initially stated that, all right, they made contact with a crazy guy trying to set up a homeless camp on the steps of the church. Obviously, you can't do that sort of thing. So they were trying to, get him up and relocate him to another area, and they found a Molotov on him. That's the initial story they told to the media. However, that's not what happened at all. This guy set up an encampment on the front steps of the church, and when he was first contacted by police, who were trying to, walk up to him and ask him what he's doing, he said basically, stay away from me, I've got explosives, I'll throw one at you if you come any closer, kind of thing. So this was already like a hostage situation right up front, right to start with. Turns out what he wanted police to do was read his 9-page manifesto of what seems to be mostly just insanity. which is what they did, and they were able to get him to surrender and arrest him and move on from there. But the bomb squad showed up because of the IED threat, obviously, and they found 200 IEDs scattered throughout his possessions and inside his tent and backpacks and stuff like that. So I have no idea what these IEDs looked like, but looking at this guy and the context of this and the alleged contents of his manifesto, I'm going to venture a wild guess that these 200 IEDs were probably Antifa specials, right? Little tiny fireworks-grade explosives which have shrapnel probably glued or taped to the outside of them. We see these a lot. So they're still explosives. They're still lethal. They're still like a very dangerous terroristic threat. But it's not like this guy had 200 155 shells with pressure plates in his tent here, right? So these 200 IEDs are probably very Antifa grade, meaning that they're very, very small, but, they're still very dangerous. They're still still a terrorist attack, right? And considering that the White House has really tried to sign a bunch of executive orders talking about domestic terrorism and things like that, here is your case. This is exactly the type of guy that you said from the White House that you were trying to target, and there's been no comment on whether or not this guy's going to face federal terrorism charges. So something to be aware of. We know this is not surprising in the slightest, but I did want to highlight it because there hasn't really been very much detail on the nuances of this case, and I did want to highlight that. Now, moving down to Tennessee, the very unfortunate explosion at the Accurate Energetic Systems Explosives Factory in Bucksnort. This was a major manufacturer for military-grade explosives. You can see here from their website, these are all of the things that they manufactured at this facility, and you can see it's a lot of very, very heavy military explosives here. And as you can see by the helicopter footage of the blast, the place is gone. It was just a catastrophic detonation that occurred there. Whatever the cause was, we may never know, as a matter of fact, because there's nothing but a crater left. As far as casualties go, officially 19 people are still missing, but looking at the before and after photos of this blast, I think we can be fairly confident these are all going to be fatalities, unfortunately. Once again, there is no indication of what took place here. There's no indication of, what happened to cause this catastrophic explosion. This facility does have a history of safety violations, but that's not entirely abnormal for most industrial facilities these days. I mean, pretty much every explosives manufacturer has a history of safety violations at this point. So I don't know if that's something that would factor into trying to establish causation. I don't know how normal that sort of thing would be at this type of facility. And I also don't know the nature of the safety violations because, again, they're making explosives for the military. It's not like they're really forthcoming with their information on what exactly they do there and the exact nature of safety violations. This is definitely one of those national security things, so we're probably not going to get the truth as to what caused this catastrophic blast, but yeah, not a great thing for sure. And it does highlight, every time one of these things happens, it does highlight the importance of being aware, paying attention, and each one of us doing what we can to make sure that we are as safe as possible, especially those who work in the industrial field. It's a very dangerous world out there, just in general, and it would be a very good idea to try to make the world a little bit less dangerous. However you can do that. If that means being a little bit safer, being the OSHA stickler, I know nobody likes to be that guy, right? Nobody likes to be that guy on the work site, but look, man, if your work site has the potential to turn into a crater, please consider being a stickler for safety and doing what you can to make sure that everybody goes home at the end of the day. Now, moving out west, something quite concerning that I wanted to mention. Again, I wrote a longer wire than normal on this topic, which of course is going to get a lot of pushback due to the nature of the nation involved with this, but I did want to mention once again that there is a targeted geofencing campaign underway at many mega churches in the western United States. So for those of you who did not read the wire report on this, there has been a major push by the government of Israel, the Israeli Foreign Ministry, to increase their image and increase their presence in American Christian churches. So the Israeli government is trying to teach you about Christianity and how Christian churches need to support the government of Israel, specifically with regards to the October 7th attacks. Again, this is literally the most forbidden topic I have found so far to discuss, so, there's really not much I can say, honestly, about it, but I did want to highlight the geofencing concerns because that's kind of a security thing. You guys can look into the media blitz on your own, but the geofencing thing is something that's interesting because it's the first time that this sort of thing has happened specifically by a foreign nation state in the context of targeting a place solely for the Christian faith. Just to get the disclaimer out, of course, targeted geofencing for advertising purposes happens literally all the time. As you're watching this on your phone, you are probably being surveilled by at least Google, who is associating your advertising ID with this particular content if you're watching it on, say, YouTube, for example. And geofencing for advertising purposes has definitely been undertaken for a while now, right? How many times have you been in a city or been in a place without a VPN turned on and you suddenly start getting ads on Twitter, for instance, about a specific city policy or something like that? Or if you turn on a VPN and say you start getting ads in different languages from the nation where your VPN is located, right? Some of these are based on IP address, right? So where your internet service provider is telling advertisers where you're located physically, but other times it is geographic, right? How many times have you gone into a store, for instance, and you go do your shopping at a particular store, and then you go back out to the parking lot, and you're sitting in your car getting ready to go home, and you get a pop-up ad from like Google Maps or something saying, "Hey, we see you visited this store. Would you like to leave a Google review for the store you just visited?" That is a geo-fenced advertising thing that links your geographic coordinate with your advertising ID. That's the kind of thing that is happening right now. The reason that I wanted to highlight it is because it's now happening to target specifically Christians who go to a Christian church. So the way that this geofencing ad campaign is being undertaken, and once again, this is using their own documentation from their FARA registration paperwork. So please, 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 please look at this document. Do not believe me in my explanation of things. Go read the document yourself and you'll see how dystopian this kind of thing is. But the general gist of how this works is you've got your cell phone in your pocket, you show up to worship services on Sunday morning at a specific time before services begin, and you take your cell phone into the church. Well, now your cell phone, because it has location services turned on and because your smartphone has an associated advertising ID, now the Israeli government is able to discern that your advertising ID is now linked with this establishment. And because you're standing in a specific circle, a geographic circle around that church, because you're standing there at a certain time, they can push ads to your phone specifically that have one purpose, at least according to their documents. The one purpose is to encourage you to think a certain way about the October 7th attacks. Now, how will this work out in practice, right? It's not like you're going to get an emergency alert push notification from, like the emergency alert system or something like that. What it means is you're going to see ads on specific apps. So if you were so inclined to pull up Twitter, for instance, at a certain time of day while standing in church, you will probably get an ad that is encouraging you to think a certain way about the nation state of Israel or about the October 7th attacks. That's what this media campaign is for. Depending on the apps that you have on your phone, it could also be a cross-platform sort of thing. So a lot of people have a weather app on their phone, right? And that weather app is generally going to request location services. And a lot of people also have push notifications turned on for their weather app a lot of times. And depending on the weather app that you use, you may get ads as push notifications if you've got like a kind of a more sketchy weather app, right? A lot of the free ones are like that. So this is just speculating, but this is how I can see this working out in practice. Is you may get a push notification from your weather app that says, "Hey, by the way, look at this documentation about the October 7th attacks," while you're standing in church. That's what this whole campaign is about, and that's what their own documentation states. So that's why I wanted to focus on this, because, this is a foreign nation state targeting Christians for simply being inside a church. And what are they targeting them for? They're targeting them to get them to think a certain way about a nation state and to get them to think a certain way about a historical event. That's how you know that the narrative is true, by the way, when you have to get advertisements rammed down your throat when you're trying to worship the Lord Jesus Christ. So, yeah, that's probably the most I can say about this sort of thing. I would encourage you to just check out the primary source documents right from the .gov website yourself and form your own opinions about what's going on here, because there's only so much I can say. Now, when it comes to what to do about this and what to do to mitigate the effects of this strategy, the first thing to do is to check out the list of churches that are being targeted by the Israeli government so far. I will put in this video, I will embed in it so that it makes it onto as many platforms as possible, a video scroll of the list itself. It's a few hundred churches, so I will make sure to put this in its entirety. I know it's kind of boring to scroll through, but I'll put it in here anyway, just so that you guys can have it for the record. But in terms of what you can do to mitigate this sort of thing, it must be noted right up front that this is not new, okay? This is not a new thing. I'm only mentioning it because it is faith-based, and it is a foreign government who does it, and because I have the documentation, right? The Israeli government did what they're supposed to do, and they filed a FARA registration, right? This company filed a Foreign Agent Registration Act packet to the U.S. government. So we have the documentation. If they were a little bit more surreptitious, or if they went through the effort of cloaking this more in a shell corporation sort of thing, then we wouldn't even know. We would not know about this. We would not have their PowerPoint slides. We would not have any of the data that this is occurring. Again, this is 100% a case of survivorship bias. We have the paperwork in front of us, so we have to make decisions off of the paperwork we have. We cannot make decisions based off of the paperwork that we don't have, but, surveillance operations that are still ongoing. So maybe, just maybe, this will be a way of encouraging Christians to think in terms of not just them being targeted because they are Americans, but being targeted because they go to church, because they are at worship services by foreign nations. And, of course, the follow-on effects from all of that, The government says this is 100% legal and is not doing anything to stop this, obviously because of the nation involved, but also because, they've pencil-whipped this sort of thing into being legal over the years. So in terms of mitigation, there's not a whole lot you can do. You can go all Jason Bourne and put your phone in a Faraday bag when you go to church or before you go to church, turn off location services, put your device in airplane mode. At the very minimum, that may help. It may not help, but it may help. A lot of times, Bluetooth is also being used to link advertising IDs together. So even if you turn your data off, even if you turn off your location services, your advertising ID is being linked with other Bluetooth devices around you. So your phone is listening for any Bluetooth devices that are around, and it can be used to associate you that way with your advertising ID. Yeah, this is pretty much squarely in the realm of digital Panopticon kind of thing, and it's pretty dystopian, but welcome to the reality of the way the world's been for about 20 years now. It's just getting a little bit more interesting because even foreign nation states are doing this sort of thing. They're doing it openly with very nice PowerPoint slides on the sort of thing. So you can do it if you want. You can put your phone in a Faraday bag before you go to church so that maybe your phone isn't going to know that you're sitting in church. You can turn off location services. You can, depending on which apps you're using and which operating systems and stuff like that, you may be able to go in and reset your advertising ID. I think Google has that as an option. But yeah, there's not a whole lot you can do. This may have happened before in the past. We just didn't know that it was being very subtle, But there's a big difference between minor surveillance that is being conducted in secret or the general gist or the general understanding that all Americans live under. That, yeah, the NSA is probably surveilling me, right? Every American kind of operates under that assumption nowadays. But that's a big difference from that general abstract, yeah, the feds are probably surveilling me for some reason. The Palantir databases, right, are sucking up every bit of data about me, right? There's a big difference between that general gist, that abstract view, and a foreign government openly advertising, proudly advertising that they are targeting Christians in the biggest ever geofencing campaign where they are siphoning up your data solely for the purposes of propaganda. They're not trying to sell you a t-shirt. They're not trying to get you to buy a cheeseburger, right? They're trying to sell an idea about a historical event to you. So maybe you see why I'm a little bit concerned about that sort of thing. Again, because it is a targeting of Christians, there will be very little media coverage of it, and people will generally not want to care about this sort of thing because, again, that's just kind of the way things are nowadays. But I wanted to focus on it because this is very important to me. Even though the churches that they're targeting are not my churches, right? They're mostly mega churches out west, but still, something to keep an eye on, something to be aware of, and something to start prodding people to be a little bit more serious with regards to living daily life. And unfortunately, that now includes church life. So now moving over to the counter-ICE efforts in both Portland and Chicago. Let's dig into this a little bit. because this has become quite a complicated thing that hopefully we can discuss and get to some sort of understanding with regards to what's going on with regards to counter-ICE efforts around the country. I wanted to highlight Portland and Chicago because these cities are both the point of consolidation for counter-ICE efforts in these areas, but they're also very different, right? So there's a lot of overlap between the two, but there's also a lot of differences between the two. So let's start with Portland first. Portland is, of course, Portland, right? Portland is internationally infamous for being a very big far-left, communist, socialist, Antifa mecca, right? And that's why they're resisting counter-immigration efforts there. Most of the counter-ICE efforts in Portland have arisen from a few different demographics. The first group are the immigrants themselves, which are a smaller group compared to the rest of the country, right? There are far fewer Mexicans in Portland than in Los Angeles, for instance. There are still enough illegal immigrants in Portland to cause trouble, but for the most part, most of the unrest in Portland is coming from the usual suspects, Antifa, right? Portland is, second to Seattle, a major Antifa hub for the region. So that's where a lot of this unrest is coming from. Antifa trying to cause problems because they are Antifa. The reason that Portland is worthy of note is because there's just a lot of them there. So as you can see, this image that was posted by the Department of Homeland Security and a bunch of other sources, this was going around on a lot of these anarchist platforms and social media where, by the way, they just maintain free control, right? If you're a leftist or an Antifa member in the United States, you can post terrorist threats, openly on the internet and nothing will happen to you, right? Yeah, I know, surprising, because Trump's in the White House and we have a hugely conservative government now, right? Allegedly. Yeah, no, Antifa still has been given a pass by the DOJ to do whatever they want. Now you can argue there's intelligence collection being undertaken. I very strongly doubt that because most of the people who work at the FBI and most of the people who work at the DOJ are far left militants themselves, right? These people physically participated in a lot of these marches for these, causes to show solidarity. So whether or not the White House specifically and, Trump's core staff are trying to weed this out, I don't know. All I know is what's happening, which is Antifa has no natural predators, which is why they're able to get away with stuff like this. Today, probably by the time this brief comes out, Antifa is openly advertising and encouraging people to shine lasers at helicopters, specifically U.S. military Blackhawks and Federal and Border Patrol Blackhawks that are flying over the city to conduct raids. Yeah, very bold move. But for those of you who think that the military is going to crack down on this, I would probably say probably not. The laser thing was used in Korea for their protests a few years ago to bring down drones and things like that, and it worked quite well because people are correct in that if you are a lone single individual and you shine a laser at a military helicopter with very fancy optics and a laser of its own, you're going to have a bad time. But if you've got 400 people in the street and they're all doing it all at the same time and no one is interested in arresting these people, guess what? They're going to get away with it. Now, for those concerned about how normal this will become by leftist groups and leftist organizations around the country, there are some tools at the federal and military level that can help mitigate the effects of lasers being used on aircraft, but maybe we'll talk about that at a later time. I'm kind of curious as to how this is going to work out, especially in Portland, because this is the first time that they have openly stated they're going to commit a felony, and I'm curious as to how that's going to work out for them. But anyway, that's Portland. Chicago's a whole other animal. Now, there's a lot of overlap between the two, but why is Chicago upset with the counter-ICE operations? It's not really Antifa in Chicago that's causing a problem, though they do have an Antifa presence that are, of course, Antifa is going to be in every major city, and even some minor cities around the country, but mostly Chicago's upset for one reason alone: gangs. Chicago's upset because a lot of gangs in Chicago run rampant, and they control the streets, and they control a lot of these places where immigrants are congregating. So drug dealers are going to get really upset if you remove their clientele from their ecosystems and you remove their drug trafficking networks from their systems. So that's why Chicago's upset, and that's why people are trying to take the fight to ICE officials there. Of course, it's also a political thing. A lot of the attacks on the ICE facility in Broadview have taken place due to the elderly, far left, but also elderly individuals who don't really have anything better to do but protest and cause problems. That's kind of a nationwide problem, but it's also low-level stuff. The more serious stuff like vehicle ramming attacks, shootings, snipings, things like that, those tend to be because of straight up cartels being involved, and they don't like ICE taking the fight to their criminal enterprises, or far left activism, right? So a lot of these vehicle ramming attacks and a lot of these straight up attacks on ICE are just due to politics, right? That's really the only way that you can encourage crime to not be policed, is due to some kind of political thing, or because you're a criminal yourself. And that tends to be how things have worked out in Chicago so far. So Portland and Chicago are two very different cities, and they're taking the fight to ICE. They're conducting these counter-ICE operations. They're learning, they're growing, they're organizing, they're getting better funding. But they're two very different cities with a little bit of overlap between the two of them. So that's why I wanted to talk about this in a little bit more depth, because there's a lot of discernment that's needed. Yes, it is a very, very, very hard mission that has no real winning solution that's easy to get to. On the one hand, you've got federal agencies like ICE, which are trying, I think they're genuinely trying to do what they can. At least some district supervisors are definitely trying to do the best they can to prevent terrorists from harming American citizens. Whereas in some other areas, we're totally fine with a foreign government, surveilling Christians going to church and trying to target them with propaganda because we've pencil whipped that into being legal, and we're just perfectly okay with that, right? So there are some things that are doing good and some things that are not going so well with regards to counterinsurgency in the homeland, but we're here now, right? And we have to do the best that we can, and if we have to talk these things out without exactly knowing the exact perfect answer for things, well, that's what we kind of have to do. So we'll continue to do that and keep an eye on the situation as we go forward. Now, moving over to the United Kingdom, jolly old England is not doing so jolly these days. There has been a lot of pushback with regards to the straight-up authoritarianism that's kind of underway in the United Kingdom, which is kind of ironic because a lot of the talk of authoritarianism is coming from within Keir Starmer's own party, right? And one of the things that's kind of come to light this past week has been the No Coke for You law, which is a new law that was instituted to ban restaurants and establishments who have, soft drinks on tap. They are no longer allowed by law to offer you a refill for certain beverages, right? For your health, right? That's the kind of way that they're framing it. What is it really? What's really going on here? It's the same exact thing that happened in the United States with the paper straws. It has no real impact on anybody because obviously people are just going to go buy another drink, right? So if they want a refill, they're just going to buy another one for however much it costs. It doesn't prevent you from buying another. It just prevents a free refill. So what is this? Well, this is a great example in power dynamics for governments. And what this is something trivial that the government can dominate a citizenry with that impacts the citizenry on a personal level, but it's trivial. It has to be trivial. That's the important part. Because what they want to say with this is we can impact you on such a trivial, meaningless way, but we're still going to dominate you, right? The fact that it's so trivial is and has no real bearing on anything is the important part. They want to make sure that you know who's in charge. That's why the paper straws thing, which are wrapped in plastic, right? It's so trivial, it's so meaningless, it's so useless, right? But it impacts you on a personal level, and it's a way for the government to impact your daily life. It's definitely a psyop. It's definitely the more, I guess, doctrinal term is information operation. Yeah, really, it's just a domination thing. So that's what that's all about. But the British people have gotten a little bit upset about it. We've seen these psyops in America many times over the years, and yeah, that's kind of what that's about. So the other thing that I thought was rather interesting is the developments with the digital ID concerns, which have deteriorated since the digital ID scheme has come to light. So as you might expect, resistance to the digital ID scheme has been rather high throughout the United Kingdom. Basically nobody, left or right, wants the digital ID scheme to come into fruition because of, well, many reasons. It's not just privacy, it's more of a data security thing. If you put all of your eggs in one basket, when a ransomware thief steals that basket, you've got yourself a bit of a problem. But again, it's often the little and seemingly meaningless details that kind of catch my eye on stuff like this. And this was the case with this article from The Guardian. At face value, alright, fine. You read the headline, it says, Explainer, why does the UK need digital IDs and what data will they include? Starmer's proposal has been criticized by rivals and civil liberties groups, and campaigners worry about people without smartphones. Okay, so fairly standard mainstream media article from The Guardian, right? But here's the thing that caught my eye. This is how they chose to write this article. So if you scroll down a little bit on the page, the whole article is formatted like this section here on the right. And the first section is, why do the people of the UK need a digital ID? And the second question is, why is Tony Blair involved? Now, isn't that an interesting way of writing an article? Isn't that very fascinating? Sometimes the things that they say and the things that they choose to say and the things they choose to not say. This article, to me, was utterly fascinating because it is a perfect example of how articles are written sometimes, betraying what the article's really about. It's almost like reading a Soviet newspaper from the height of the Khrushchev era, where they can't really talk about something directly, but they can definitely talk about it indirectly. So this article's headline is trying to explain, why does the UK need digital IDs and what's the digital ID thing about? And the first two things they choose to talk about are, why do we even need this and why is Tony Blair involved? The fact that they wrote these in this order and wrote about them at all, why is Tony Blair involved? That shows you who's controlling the marionette strings with this, right? And I find that to be utterly fascinating to the point of hilarity, that this is how they wrote this article. It's not like they started with, there's immigration, right? Or, because that's what the British government's perspective is. Oh, we're doing this because of immigration. No, that's not what The Guardian says. The Guardian is trying to ask a rhetorical question, or try to ask a question that the citizens are asking, which is, why do we need this? And why is Tony Blair involved? That is hilarious. And it kind of shows you what everybody's thinking about this sort of thing, even though the Guardian's articles are, it's the Guardian, right? So anyway, I thought that was interesting that this is going over so poorly that they had to literally ask these questions and try to answer them in the most politically correct way right up front. And that's what the article's about. And I think this is interesting for those of you who have mentally checked out because this is about the UK and you don't really care. I will see your Guardian article and raise you a Fox News article. This was published a couple of days ago on October 9th, and the title of this Fox News, again, Fox News, article is, UK faces backlash over mandatory digital ID, could US be next? Seems like a fairly standard headline for Fox News, something you probably would just scroll past, unless you're watching it on TV, I guess. But the subheading betrays what Fox News is trying to push. The subheading reads, Digital ID expert says controversy stems from fear, poor conception, and lack of education. That's why I chose the Fox News article on this, because Fox News, which has historically been the conservative alt-right boogeyman news group, newsflash, it's not. Even Fox News is trying to push people to accept a digital ID here in the United States. Now, I could pull any other article from CNN, MSNBC, ABC, NBC, all of these other, the traditionally more leftist groups. Even the AP would probably have something positive to say about digital ID. But I chose this one specifically to show you that this is truly a bicameral effort. This is a bipartisan effort to try to shape perception here in the United States. So when Fox News, of all places, is trying to get people to accept a digital ID and, oh, no, these fears are unjust. You just need to be educated. You need to be educated about what's going on with this digital ID thing. Yeah, that's something to be aware of. You can kind of see where the tides are shifting on that sort of thing. But we all know how this goes, right? That's why I put these images on the slide with this article, because we know how this goes. We've heard this before. The United States, guess what? We have had a national ID effort, the real ID effort, right? Remember that push from a few years back? In Congress, we had liberal politicians and conservative politicians unite together, uniparty style, to pass the Real ID Act, so that we had all 50 states, or all states which wanted to participate in this program, to have real IDs, right? To have identification documents, driver's licenses, which would be of one sort of same standard for things like TSA and interstate travel. There was this massive push from a bunch of conservative politicians, a bunch of liberal politicians. They both were talking about how great this was going to be for security and immigration and, counterterrorism and things like that. And what happened? This week we found out that a lot of states were just issuing driver's licenses, CDLs, with no name given on them. These people can get on a plane with no name given driver's licenses because they're Real ID compliant driver's licenses, right? So, yeah, we all know how this goes. We all know what's going on, but I thought it was very interesting in typical fashion because I tend to focus on things that probably don't really matter in the long run, but I found it was interesting, so I wanted to talk about it. But anyway, I find it very interesting that we're going to lock you down, we're going to make sure that you have this digital ID, but I wonder how many people in the UK and eventually in the US when this comes to the US, I wonder how many people are going to have a digital ID on their phone that says no name given. Probably quite a few, because they don't want these people's actual names. They don't want them in biometrics so that when they commit crimes, they have no record, right? Because you just don't even know their name or anything about them, right? So anyway, I thought that was kind of interesting how the digital Panopticon is certainly here. However, that Panopticon has blind spots in a few areas. So some people get surveilled more than others, particularly if you go to church on Sunday. But if you're at an Antifa riot and you're shining lasers at helicopters, there's probably not going to be much that happens to you. So anyway, a selective digital Panopticon sort of situation, which contributes to the very interesting times that we live in and the challenges we have to work through. So that's pretty much all I have for today, and let's roll up with the intercepted GhostNet reports where we can try to get ahead of the information crackdown and try to increase our resiliency in a more off-grid, more radio-based way. This is the GhostNet communications plan. It's a ham radio plan, mostly shortwave radio, or HF, high-frequency radio, is a very interesting tool that we can use to communicate with people over long distances without having any sort of infrastructure in between. We created this GhostNet plan so that we could all kind of get on the same page and have a more resilient way of exchanging information, not just for an emergency use or more of a hobby sort of thing, but more of a practical thing. I have been working on improving the GhostNet over time to try to integrate some other systems and things like that. So there is a Mesh-tastic channel for the GhostNet. There are also VHF and UHF options for those of you who just have the ubiquitous Baofeng, right? The infamous little radio that could, right? So if all you have is a cheap radio, don't feel left out. You can definitely engage with it. It's probably not going to be very effective for line of sight stuff. This is more of an HF thing so that we can connect people from all over the world together kind of at the same time. And that's kind of hard to do with line of sight, especially if you don't have repeater networks. This is definitely more of an autonomous kind of thing, decentralized sort of information exchange system. And as we can see, there's a lot of information being exchanged every week and even throughout the week. It's not the greatest thing since sliced bread, but it is one way that we can stay connected, especially if everything goes out, if the internet goes out, if power goes out, if everybody's disconnected from one another. This is how we can exchange information over long distances fairly effectively. So thank you to all of you who make the GhostNet great. Thank you to all of you who participate in that. And thank you to all you guys out there who are just listen only. Even if you're just listening and you don't have a license and so you can't transmit, it's good that you're participating in it anyway and trying to do the best you can to stay informed. So that's all I have for today. Here are the sources for this week's reports. You can also grab the links and primary source material if I can snag it on each Obsidian page for each wire report throughout the day. So even though I'm taking the wire reports from Obsidian and pasting them into social media, right? You don't see the source material on social media. You can click that link and then go to my Obsidian page where I have all the other links. I have to do it this way because a lot of social media pages simply just deprioritize. If they see that I have a lot of links in a post, they will just block that post and only I can see it, right? This is the way the world works, unfortunately. That's why my wire reports don't get pushed by Twitter's algorithm too much, because even one link is enough to deprioritize this. But my priority is the information, not necessarily reach, a lot of times on Twitter at least. And I want to make sure you guys can get access to the primary source material if you want to investigate further, which you definitely should. If you want to look at the primary sources that I use to make each wire report, I do the best I can to try to put those there. So there's always more research to be had. There's always more ways to verify that information is true. In today's age of significant information manipulation efforts, it's always good to try to get to the bottom of the truth as best you can, right? So thank you to all of you who have stuck around. Thank you to all of you on Patreon who support me there and keep this work going. I really do appreciate it. Couldn't do it without you guys, so thank you for that. And I will see you next time. And as always, fight in the shade.